History records many unusual royal deaths, kings slain on the battlefield, poisoned in their sleep, or struck down by conspirators. Some passed quietly, others violently, but few with the theatrical horror that accompanied the final moments of Charles II of Navarre. Among the annals of medieval demise, one death stands out as especially haunting, grotesque, and unforgettable. The fiery end of a king known more for cunning than courage. Known in his lifetime as Charles the Bad, his legacy was already stained by a career of betrayal, shifting loyalties, and the ruthless exercise of political manipulation. He was feared by rivals, esquimals, mistrusted by allies, and remembered in court chronicles less for heroism than for plots, poisons, and hidden daggers. But all of this was eclipsed by the terrifying strangeness of his final moments. Burned alive in his bed, wrapped in linen bandages soaked with flammable spirits. His death was so bizarre, so symbolic, that it captured not only the attention of his contemporaries, but remained embedded in Europe's historical imagination for centuries to come. Was it divine punishment, as many in the deeply religious 14th century believed? The just wrath of heaven for a life filled with lies and power plays? Was it a cruel accident, the result of an inattentive servant and a tragic miscalculation? Or, as some speculated at the time, was it something more sinister, perhaps even sabotage, carried out by enemies within his own court? At the heart of this mystery was a singular substance, gold. Not the metal in coin or crown, but in elixir, an alchemical creation that promised to purify, to strengthen, even to bestow a form of immortality. Charles believed in its power. He believed in the idea that alchemy could deliver him from age and illness. He had spent a lifetime trying to outmaneuver death through diplomacy and deceit. Now, he sought to defy it through science. This is the story of Charles II of Navarre, a monarch who gambled everything on survival, a king of endless intrigue, and a man whose search for eternal life ended in a blaze so spectacular it became legend. His is a tale of ambition, fear, and the catastrophic price of placing faith in the unknown. To understand the man and his end, we must first understand his world. The 14th century was a time of fracture, upheaval, and shifting allegiances. Europe was gripped by plague, war, economic instability, and religious uncertainty. The Black Death, which swept through the continent between 1347 and 1351, decimated populations and upended the social fabric. With a third of Europe's population dead, economies collapsed, labor shortages erupted, and long-standing hierarchies began to erode. Nobility and clergy who survived were forced to reckon with a new world shaped by fear and mortality. At the same time, the 100 Years' War between England and France raged on, destabilizing the political order even further. Feudal loyalties were tested, borders were redrawn, and monarchs struggled to assert control over increasingly independent nobles. The war was not only about crowns, it was about the legitimacy of dynasties, the control of trade routes, and the assertion of national identity in an era that lacked modern nation-states. Into this volatile landscape stepped Charles II of Navarre. His kingdom was small, but strategically positioned, straddling the Pyrenees and sitting between major powers like France, England, Castile, and Aragon. It was a land both overlooked and coveted, a space that could serve as a corridor for armies or as a buffer for diplomacy. Charles was born in 1332 to Philip III of Navarre and Joan II, daughter of Louis X of France and queen in her own right. Through her, Charles inherited not only Navarre but valuable territories in Normandy, regions rich in resources and political leverage. These holdings placed him directly in the path of French royal ambitions and allowed him to play a dangerous game of power between rival crowns. Navarre's modest size belied its importance. It served as a hinge point in the grand strategies of Western Europe. Its monarch had to be nimble, decisive, and willing to use whatever leverage he possessed. Charles was all of that, and more. He was not merely shrewd, he was ruthless, calculating, and consumed by a need to remain relevant at any cost. From his youth, Charles honed his skills as a political manipulator. He allied with Edward III of England when it suited him, only to later switch sides and negotiate directly with the French court. He married strategically, deployed spies across courts, and was unafraid to employ assassination as a tool of policy. He became infamous for his involvement in the murder of Charles de Lacerda, the French king's favorite advisor. It was a clear and brutal message. Charles II was not afraid to use violence to protect or expand his influence. His court became synonymous with danger, his name whispered in fear and admiration alike. His use of poison, whether fact or rumor, further elevated his notoriety. Nobles and clerics alike feared inviting him to banquets. His meals were tested, his guards rotated frequently. He projected paranoia and power in equal measure. This aura of menace made him a central, if unstable, player in the great game of European politics. Charles's reputation spread quickly. Chroniclers of the time dubbed him Charles the Bad, not solely for acts of cruelty, but because of the constant threat he represented. He was perceived as a destabilizing force, unpredictable, clever, and utterly self-serving. And yet, in an age defined by duplicity and ambition, he was also begrudgingly admired for his intellect and his ability to outmaneuver more powerful adversaries. But his relentless pursuit of influence came at a cost. The French monarchy, though once tolerant of his maneuvers, grew weary of his manipulations. The English, once hopeful allies, saw him as a liability. By the latter half of his reign, Charles had lost much of his political capital, both domestically and abroad. Yet he never gave up the game. Even as his physical strength waned, he continued plotting, negotiating, and seeking ways to secure his legacy. That enduring hunger for relevance, for power, for control would not only define his reign, but would ultimately shape the strange and tragic way in which he met his end. Charles's most defining trait was his ability to play both sides in the 100 Years' War. While the English and French crowns struggled for dominance, Charles positioned himself as an indispensable ally to both, only to betray them when it suited his goals. His entire political philosophy seemed rooted in fluid allegiance, never fixed, always flexible, always self-serving. In the 1350s, he struck a formal alliance with Edward III of England, offering military and strategic support in return for promises of territory and recognition of his claims. English hopes rested heavily on Charles's ability to rally Norman lords and apply pressure to the French monarchy from within. But Charles had no intention of becoming a mere proxy. Almost as soon as he pledged himself to England, he opened a separate channel of negotiations with the French king, John II. He calculated correctly that the French would offer more land, money, titles if he were willing to turn against his English patrons. Within months, Charles had renegotiated his position with France, gained new estates, and abandoned the English cause. His duplicity was not a secret. Ambassadors wrote of him with exasperation. Chroniclers painted him as a man with no allegiance but to himself. This cycle of alliance and betrayal repeated itself throughout his reign. No matter how many times he was ostracized, Charles returned to the negotiating table with another offer, another threat, another bribe. He was a man who could not be ignored. He was not loyal, but he was useful. But politics were only part of his arsenal. Charles developed a reputation for weaponizing fear and uncertainty. He cultivated an image of danger, not only through military might, but through darker means. Rumors of poison swirled around his court. Some were likely true. The most infamous case was the death of Charles de Lacerda in 1354, the French king's favored constable. De Lacerda was murdered by a group of Navarre's agents, almost certainly on Charles's orders. The killing was brutal and public, its message unmistakable. It shocked the French court and marked a turning point in Charles's campaign to dominate Normandy. With one calculated strike, he removed a powerful rival and destabilized the king's authority. Though the French condemned the act, they also responded by granting Charles further concessions in a desperate attempt to avoid full rebellion. Poisoning became a motif associated with Charles. He was believed to use it to eliminate rivals, coerce nobles, and control outcomes. Though evidence is sparse, The consistency of these accusations across sources suggests at least a partially deserved reputation. His court was a place of shifting alliances, constant surveillance, and persistent fear. Charles trusted no one, not even his closest advisors. He rotated his council regularly, executed suspected traitors without trial, and kept mercenaries close to enforce his will. Meals were prepared under watchful eyes, tasted beforehand, and often discarded altogether. Even within his own chambers, Charles lived like a hunted man. This pervasive paranoia was not entirely irrational. Charles made enemies easily: kings, nobles, even his own subjects. He ruled through dominance, not affection, and his governance style reflected his lack of faith in human loyalty. In his later years, his influence diminished, but his ambitions never waned. As age sapped his strength, his mind remained sharp, calculating, dangerous. He still wrote letters with coded instructions, issued bribes to keep nobles in line, and commissioned plots against political opponents. He could no longer ride to war, but he could still manipulate events from his chamber. And so, when illness eventually struck, Charles turned not to conventional medicine, but to what he believed was the frontier of healing: alchemy. Doctors were not enough for a king who distrusted ordinary men. He sought miraculous restoration through gold, through mystery, through the promise of eternal strength. His body might have weakened, but his belief in control over life, death, and fate itself remained undiminished. It was this belief that would ultimately betray him. In 1387, Charles fell gravely ill. His body, worn by decades of treachery, paranoia, and the physical toll of rule, began to give way. What had once been the frame of a vigorous monarch now showed signs of irreversible decay. His skin grew sallow, his limbs ached, and his energy waned. He was in his mid-50s, an old age for the 14th century, but Charles would not accept the approach of death passively. He believed there had to be a way to fight it, a way to outmaneuver death as he had outmaneuvered rivals. Rather than turn to the standard physicians of his court, Charles turned to those who promised more than medicine. He turned to alchemists. In the world of medieval science, alchemy held a mysterious and potent allure. It promised not just cures, but miracles. Alchemists claimed they could transform base metals into gold, extend life, and cleanse the soul through physical purification. Their language was cryptic, their methods arcane, but their promises were seductive, especially to a king desperate to defy mortality. Among the upper classes, belief in the curative power of gold had become increasingly fashionable. Gold, it was believed, was the purest of all substances, immune to corrosion, symbolically linked to the sun, and untouched by the decay of time. Alchemical philosophy argued that this purity could be transferred to the human body. In liquid form, gold was thought to cleanse the blood, strengthen the heart, and protect against disease. Kings and nobles across Europe experimented with such elixirs, often at great cost and little result. Charles's court physicians, influenced by these ideas and eager to appease their ruler, prepared a potent elixir. The exact formula has not survived, but it likely consisted of powdered gold suspended in strong alcohol, possibly infused with other herbal or mystical ingredients. While many gold tinctures were ingested, in Charles's case, the treatment was meant for external application, a method believed to allow the body to absorb the vitality of gold directly through the skin. The preparation of the king for this ritualistic treatment was elaborate. Servants removed his garments, exposing his frail and possibly ulcerated skin. The golden mixture was carefully rubbed across his limbs and torso with slow, methodical strokes. To enhance the absorption and prevent evaporation, his body was then wrapped tightly in fine linen soaked in alcohol. It may have been wine or a distilled spirit, whatever the substance. It was flammable and dangerously volatile. The procedure was conducted with a reverence bordering on the religious. Every step followed with ceremonial solemnity, guided by a belief that this was more than medicine. It was a transformation, a final alchemical rebirth. The linen wrappings, warm and pungent with alcohol, sealed the elixir against the king's flesh. It was a final, desperate attempt to restore the body and prolong life. Then came the last stage, trimming the wrappings and sealing the treatment. In a poorly lit chamber, the servant responsible for this task made a catastrophic mistake. Perhaps fatigued, perhaps unaware of the danger, he brought an open candle too close. The result was instantaneous. The alcohol-soaked linens ignited with explosive force. Flames raced across Charles's body, enveloping him in seconds. His bed became an inferno. Witnesses described screams that pierced the walls, shrieks of pain from a king who moments earlier had hoped for rebirth. The servants panicked. Some fled. Others tried desperately to smother the fire with blankets or water. But the fire had already done its damage. By the time the blaze was subdued, Charles was horrifically burned. His skin charred, muscles exposed, and the stench of scorched flesh filled the room. Physicians could do nothing. He lingered in agony, hours, perhaps longer, unable to find peace, unable even to speak. Eventually, he died, consumed not by age or disease, but by the very treatment meant to save him. His death was brutal, chaotic, and deeply symbolic, a moment of grotesque irony that would overshadow everything he had done in life. Chroniclers such as Jean Froissart preserve the details, fascinated and horrified by the scene. They saw in it a divine message, the dangers of pride, the folly of tampering with the natural order, and the inescapable justice of fate. The legend spread quickly, of a king who sought immortality through gold, only to die screaming, his body engulfed in the flames of his own ambition. Whether every detail was literal truth or shaped by the dramatic flair of medieval storytelling, the essence remains chillingly real. A monarch, grasping at the secrets of eternal life, became a cautionary tale, a man betrayed not by enemies, but by belief in the impossible. The death of Charles II of Navarre in such horrific fashion sent shockwaves through the region. It was not merely the fact that he died, it was how he died, engulfed in flames, shrieking in agony, the victim of his own alchemical ambitions. In an age where spectacle shaped public memory, this was a spectacle few could forget. His sudden and scandalous demise left his kingdom in disarray. The court, long used to functioning under Charles's domineering rule, found itself paralyzed. Key alliances were left unresolved. Court factions jostled for control in the absence of firm leadership. There were fears of rebellion among the nobility and murmurs that divine punishment had not yet run its course. Into this confusion stepped his son, Charles III, later called Charles the Noble. He inherited more than a crown. He inherited a kingdom tainted by years of duplicity, suspicion, and the long shadow of his father's infamy. The younger Charles recognized immediately the need for transformation. He could not rule as his father had, not with fear, not with poison, not with ever-shifting loyalty. He would have to restore dignity to the throne. Charles III began with reconciliation. He reopened dialogue with the French crown, repaired relations with internal noble houses, and curbed the court's appetite for espionage and purges. He implemented reforms aimed at transparency, consistency, and justice, terms that had been foreign under his father's reign. Over time, his efforts bore fruit. While never a dominant player in continental politics, Navarre under Charles III became stable, respected, and internally cohesive. Internationally, Charles II's death marked the final decline of Navarre's influence in broader European power struggles. In previous decades, the kingdom had played England and France against each other with cunning. But after the fire and the fall of Charles the Bad, Navarre no longer held the political capital to act as a broker. The kingdom retreated from the center of European politics and turned its attention inward, toward consolidation, stability, and reform. Its era of manipulation was over. Yet perhaps the most lasting consequence was not political but symbolic. To many, Charles's death was more than a tragic accident. It was divine judgment. In a deeply religious and superstitious age, the imagery of a king dying in flames resonated profoundly. Clerics across Europe spoke of the fire as God's retribution for decades of deceit, treachery, and arrogance. The symbolism was irresistible. A man who had sought to cheat death through gold and alchemy, punished by the very forces he tried to command. Medieval society, steeped in theological interpretation, viewed such endings as moral lessons. Charles' death became a parable, one told in sermons, in manuscripts, and at royal courts. His downfall was cited as evidence that no human, no matter how powerful, could escape divine justice. The idea that pride precedes destruction was etched into the narrative of his final days. The golden elixir, once a symbol of alchemical brilliance and eternal life, transformed into a cautionary symbol of hubris. What was meant to save him had become the agent of his demise. Alchemists, once courted by kings, now faced heightened skepticism. Some were dismissed, others fled. In the years that followed, references to Charles II of Navarre would often accompany warnings about the dangers of pursuing unnatural power. For Charles, the pursuit of immortality did not end in triumph. It ended in immolation. His death was not merely notable, it was unforgettable. And in that, perhaps, he did achieve a form of immortality, though not the kind he had hoped for. Charles II's death would outlive his reign. For generations, the story was retold with variations, but always with the same core: a king consumed by his own ambition, punished by fire. It became a staple of medieval lore, told in royal courts, village taverns, and cloisters alike. The story evolved into something larger than a chronicle, a morality tale, a parable illustrating the dangers of hubris. Artists illustrated it, clergy cited it in sermons, teachers passed it to their pupils. In every retelling, Charles was not just a monarch, he was a warning. As time went on, the legend merged with broader themes of human overreach. Charles was grouped with mythical figures like Icarus, men who tried to transcend natural limits and paid the ultimate price. His fate, death by the very method meant to preserve him, was too poetic, too symbolic to ignore. Even when softened by time, the narrative retained its moral weight. Do not place yourself above nature, or the divine will rectify your arrogance. In the broader history of alchemy, Charles's death served as an emblematic caution. Alchemy would continue to thrive for centuries through the courts of Renaissance princes and within the secretive laboratories of early scientists, but the specter of failure always lingered. The accidents, the fires, the mental breakdowns of those who sought too much too quickly, these were not isolated cases. Charles became, in retrospect, one of the earliest public faces of the risks inherent in pseudoscientific experimentation. While some still admired alchemy for its philosophical insights and practical offshoots, others pointed to Charles as a victim of blind faith in an unproven art. His death did not halt alchemical inquiry, but it introduced a note of caution into its pursuit. Writers began referencing him in tracts warning of recklessness. His name became shorthand for the hazards of ambition untethered from evidence. Navarre would go on, but never again would one of its monarchs hold the sway or notoriety of Charles the Bad. His successors ruled with more moderation, more diplomacy, but less consequence. Charles's reputation, though infamous, gave him a kind of stature that outlasted his lineage. His deeds, both real and exaggerated, became more studied than his reforms. Even centuries later, his name would evoke images of fire, gold, and folly. In academic circles, modern historians approach the accounts with a more tempered eye. Froissart's vivid descriptions, while invaluable, are colored by the narrative tendencies of medieval chroniclers, writers who blended reportage with entertainment and moralism. Nevertheless, the core facts are difficult to dispute. Charles did experiment with alchemical remedies. Alcohol played a role. A fire occurred. The king, in agony, perished. Even if the precise sequence of events was dramatized, the outcome remains chillingly factual. The truth, stripped of fable, is still astonishing. That a king would seek to escape mortality through mysticism only to perish by its hand offers a story as compelling now as it was 6 centuries ago. It is not merely a tale of a death, it is a lens into a worldview where science, faith and desperation collided. And it reminds us that even those who sit atop thrones are vulnerable to the same frailties, fears, and fatal mistakes as the humblest of their subjects. In the end, the story of Charles II of Navarre is one of contradictions, grand and petty, political and personal, mortal and symbolic. A brilliant strategist undone by overreach who knew how to manipulate kings but not his own fate. A cunning politician laid low not by a rival's sword, but by the frailty of his own body and the miscalculation of a servant. A ruler obsessed with life extension who ended up embodying one of the most cautionary deaths in royal history. The 14th century was an age of belief not just in divine right, but in mystery, in omens, in the power of relics, in the idea that gold, the incorruptible metal, could purify the soul and fortify the flesh. Charles II did not simply dabble in these ideas. He embraced them with the desperation of a man who had seen too many plots and lived too many close calls. He had survived betrayal, war, and diplomatic isolation. Why not survive time itself? He placed his trust in alchemy not as a curiosity, but as a solution. He believed in it as his salvation, but it became his doom. His death in flames is remembered not just because of its horror, but because of its bitter irony, because it turned a final attempt at control into an emblem of chaos. The fatal intersection of ambition, superstition, and the limits of the human body played out not in myth, but in fact. History judges Charles the Bad not solely by what he did in life, though his record is ample. He is judged just as much by how he left the world, in agony, in fire, undone by the same arrogance that had defined his reign. And perhaps that is the final irony. For all his attempts to shape Europe through treaties and daggers, to rewrite his story with gold and mystery, it was a candle, humble, flickering, and thoughtlessly handled, that wrote the last line of his legend. Not a weapon of state, but a tool of light, made him immortal in the one way he never intended.